Welcome to Notes on Teaching, where we discuss best educational practices in the context of the band, choir, or general music class. This week's episode is going to be on literacy instruction. First, nobody panic. I'm going to go out on a limb here and say that as specials teachers, we are often not very receptive to teaching strategies or content that seems to be outside of our realm of expertise. Literacy has to be the exception, though, especially in the case of music. We teach strategies that support student development and literacy all the time. Left to right fluency, interpretation of technical symbols, decoding notes and rhythms, even echo singing or modeling for students support speaking standards related to inflection. So instead of jumping right into the model, I'd first like to explain why it's important that we not only include appropriately complex texts in our classroom, but also model best literacy instruction practices. First, we're all responsible for literacy in our content areas, as Ohio included literacy standards across content areas in 2009. Second, using appropriately complex content-specific texts is beneficial to deepen student understanding in our unique content. Third, that deeper understanding leads to long-lasting knowledge connection and supports knowledge transfer goals across the curriculum. So really, it's good for us and it's good for our students long-term. The instructional strategy for literacy teaching that I've chosen to model in a music setting is called List, Group, Label. Even though the unit that I'm going to be using this strategy with is geared at high school students, I can see this being useful in an elementary or a middle school setting as well. It's pretty portable and it's great at connecting and documenting background knowledge for a unit or topic, as well as increasing vocabulary. So first, students are going to make lists of vocabulary words that can relate to the topic or the unit being studied. The list can be generated individually if the students are older, but younger groups may choose to do this as a whole class activity. After documenting the list, students will then be broken into small groups, and they'll begin organizing the words based on concepts or how they are related to each other. Lots of discussion and maybe even some facilitation is good here. After grouping the words, students will label the groups into categories. It's important during the group phase that they're only grouping the words and they're not trying to apply the labels until all of the groups are established. Finally, student categories and lists should be shared with the whole class. As the activity wraps up, it's important to highlight that they're building vocabulary in order to learn to use words appropriately in the appropriate settings. Where and how we're going to use this, I've chosen to use this literacy strategy in the first day of my national anthem unit as kind of an introductory activity, because by the time they're in high school, students have already had some native experience with our national anthem, the Star-Spangled Banner. Because of how we experience that piece of music in our culture, they have existing background knowledge that we can expand upon. My how. Students are going to be broken into groups. In my advanced choir, if I was going to use this, I would plan to use their SATB groupings already. So I would use their voice parts to divide them. They could also work in sections in a band class. If you have a mixed grade level group, you could put all of your freshmen, your sophomores, your juniors, your seniors together in that way, or even split them up just randomly based on numbers. I plan to give my students paper first to document the individual vocab, and then a list-based kind of graphic organizer once they're ready to start categorizing their vocabulary. It's time to model the list group label strategy. So list, once again, in the first step, students are going to develop those individual lists. Again, the background knowledge is helpful, but the list generated shouldn't be predetermined. This is a timed activity, shouldn't take more than 8 to 10 minutes to get them to generate that list, and we're going to aim for 20 to 30 vocabulary words per student. So when I think of the national anthem, here are my 20 or so words that come to mind. You'll notice some of them are phrases as well, like War of 1812, early morning, drinking song, instrumental A flat, etc. In the group step, students are going to work in small groups and combine their vocabulary lists. Through discussion, they'll place the words into groups as they see the relationships develop between the words or ideas. So here's our list. And the important thing to remember here is that there's no limit to the number of groups or ideas that are used to categorize the words. And at this point, there shouldn't be any specific label to the groups yet. In the third step, students' groups are going to develop labels for their vocabulary groupings. Once again, the number of groups and the actual labels that they are applied to them don't really matter here. The important feature is that they are discussing and justifying the placement of each of the related word groupings. Through discussion, they may even deem it necessary to move a word or remove a word from their list. This is part of the process. After all the words have been assigned to a group, or moved or removed, then the category name should take shape. So you can see here that my categories have been labeled history, social justice, music, and lyrics. Differentiation. So how will this benefit or fit all of my students? If we're thinking about differentiating this particular method and really the unit itself from a student ability standpoint, the best strategy that seemed to fit everything well for me was flexible groupings. Using flexible groupings during this strategy and throughout the unit would be a really excellent application of differentiation. A variation on the strategy itself could involve moving the groups around in a few different ways. So maybe after they've developed their groups, make them switch so that they can see how everybody else is categorizing words and how their vocabulary lists differ from group to group, could create a more diverse experience for individual learners there as well. As a differentiation strategy, it allows students to build community. That is key in an ensemble class. It encourages independent and collaborative work and can allow attention to readiness needs, interests, and then different approaches to learning if we're thinking about it from an educator standpoint. Once again, remember, failure is always an option when trying a new instructional strategy. In the case of literacy strategies, if the work is done intentionally on the front end, so we're finding quality text, that can be half the battle. I would also recommend trying a literacy strategy and integrating shorter texts as supports for the music you're already teaching as a means to introduce your students to these content-specific literacy strategies in small doses. For my general music colleagues and my band colleagues, let's take a look at how and where we can find some of this information. So what do I use and where does it come from? First, nearly anything can be a text. You just have to use it appropriately in order to build the desired literacy skills. You can always find information through ReadWorks, Newsela, Library of Congress, a lot of those traditional English languagey sort of websites. But let's look at music specifically. For my general music colleagues, you likely already integrate children's literature or storybooks into your lessons. If you don't, reach out to your ELA colleagues or your school librarians for recommendations. They could also maybe recommend some poetry collections, or you could subscribe to the Music K-8 magazine for some quality inspiration materials. Also, don't forget about folk songs, right? Folk songs are part of our history. They're part of our standard national music curriculum. So NAFME and the Library of Congress have decided to partner and offer recordings and texts for primary sources. Perhaps my ensemble colleagues, so my band, choir, and orchestra friends, can also find inspiration through the composer's notes or source material that is being programmed for your upcoming concert. Remember, again, the NAFME and primary sources material. Thanks to the Lomax project from the early 20th century, lots of recordings of American folk songs and different genres are housed through the Library of Congress, so seek that material out. You could also connect with living composers and check those program or rehearsal notes that are provided in the score. Or if you're doing an arrangement, provide your students with recordings or paper copies of the original compositions to do some comparative analysis. I'm sure there are some interviews and some writings on those as well that you could seek out. There are lots of opportunities for rich classroom discussions and for exposing students to deeper meaning in their music by integrating these content-specific texts into our teaching. I hope you now have a good idea of how to introduce quality literacy instructional strategies into your specials classroom. Thank you for watching. Once again, this has been Notes on Teaching.